My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old now, though this story takes me back to when I was 28, standing in the middle of what I thought was my life, but turned out to be a carefully constructed illusion. You know how sometimes you look back at a moment and realize it was the exact second everything changed? Mine happened over a birthday cake, of all things, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a simple family dinner became the catalyst for uncovering decades of lies and finally finding my voice in a family that had spent years trying to silence it. I grew up in what most people would call a typical middle-class family in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. We had the two-story house with the wraparound porch, the minivan that always smelled faintly of coffee and whatever fast food we'd grabbed that week, and Sunday dinners where everyone talked over each other while passing around my mother's famous pot roast. From the outside, we looked like any other family. But families are like icebergs, aren't they? What you see on the surface is just a fraction of what's really there, and the parts hidden underneath can sink ships. My mother, Linda, was the kind of woman who kept her house spotless and her opinions sharp. She had this way of delivering criticism wrapped in concern, like a bitter pill dipped in honey. You'd swallow it before realizing it was poison. My father, Robert, was quieter, the type who'd learned early in their marriage that the path of least resistance was usually through agreement. He fixed things around the house, went to work at the accounting firm where he'd been for 20 years, and generally stayed out of the emotional hurricanes that my mother liked to stir up. Then there was my sister, Brittany, 3 years older and everything I apparently wasn't. She'd married her college boyfriend, had 2 kids by 25, and lived in a house 4 blocks from our parents. She had the life my mother had mapped out for both of us, checking every box on the acceptable daughter checklist. And me? Well, I was the one who'd moved 40 minutes away to the city, lived alone in a studio apartment that my mother called depressing, and was still trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, despite being closer to 30 than 20. The extended family was its own ecosystem of dysfunction. There was Uncle Dennis, my mother's brother, who owned a chain of car dealerships and never let anyone forget it. He had this booming laugh that filled up rooms and a habit of measuring everyone's worth by their bank account. His wife, Aunt Patricia, was one of those women who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, always dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon even when we were just having backyard barbecues. And then there was my Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister, who lived out in Seattle and only came back for major holidays. She was different from the rest of them, quieter, more thoughtful. She'd moved away young and built a life that didn't revolve around family approval. I'd always admired her for that, though I'd never said it out loud. The birthday that changed everything started like any other. It was a Friday in early March, and the weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or spring. I woke up in my apartment to gray skies and the sound of rain against my windows. I'd been unemployed for 3 months at that point, laid off from my marketing job at a startup that had run out of funding. The job search was brutal, and every rejection email felt like another confirmation of what my family already believed, that I couldn't quite get my life together. I spent the morning the way I'd spent most mornings lately, scrolling through job listings, tailoring cover letters, and trying not to calculate how many more months I could survive on my savings. By noon, I'd sent out 4 applications and was nursing my 3rd cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. It was my cousin Emma, one of the few family members I genuinely enjoyed. Her text was simple but made me smile. "Happy early birthday! Heard there's a family dinner planned for you tonight. Want me to be your escape driver if things get weird?" Emma understood our family dynamics better than most because she'd been on the receiving end of them herself. She'd gotten pregnant at 19, decided to keep the baby, and had endured years of whispered conversations and pointed looks at family gatherings. Now, at 34, she was a successful real estate agent and single mother to the most amazing teenager, but the family still treated her like she'd never quite redeemed herself for that early mistake. I texted her back, "Might take you up on that." Linda insisted on organizing something. I'm already exhausted and I haven't even shown up yet. The restaurant they'd chosen was Giovanni's, this sprawling Italian place on the north side of town that tried too hard to look authentic. They had those checkered tablecloths that felt sticky no matter how recently they'd been cleaned, walls covered in generic Italian posters, and a soundtrack of the same 10 Dean Martin songs on endless repeat. But the food was decent, the wine was cheap, and it was loud enough that you could have an argument without the other tables noticing, which made it perfect for my family. I spent too long deciding what to wear. Everything in my closet felt wrong. Too casual, and my mother would make comments about how I'd given up on myself. Too dressy, and Brittany would ask if I had a job interview afterward, her voice dripping with fake concern. I finally settled on dark jeans, a burgundy blouse that I knew looked good on me, and ankle boots that gave me an extra 2 inches of height and, hopefully, confidence. The drive to the restaurant was peaceful, just me and the radio and the windshield wipers keeping rhythm. I tried to prepare myself mentally, running through the usual list of topics to avoid: my employment status, my living situation, my relationship status, perpetually single, much to my mother's horror, and anything that might give them ammunition for their particular brand of caring criticism. I told myself I just had to get through dinner, a couple of hours maximum. I could do that. When I walked into Giovanni's, I spotted my family immediately. They'd taken over a long table in the back corner, and the scene was so familiar it could have been any family dinner from the last decade. My parents sat at one end, my mother's purse placed carefully on the empty chair beside her like a barrier. Brittany was next to them, checking her phone while her husband, Marcus, tried to keep their 2 kids from destroying the breadstick basket. Uncle Dennis held court at the center of the table, his voice carrying across the restaurant as he told some story about a customer who'd tried to negotiate on a fully loaded SUV. I noticed Emma sitting at the far end and made my way toward her, but my mother's voice stopped me. "Sarah, there you are. We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." She said it with a smile, but there was that edge underneath, the one that suggested I was already failing to meet expectations by being exactly on time instead of early. "Traffic," I said, which was partly true. There's always traffic in Columbus. I took the empty seat next to Emma, who gave me a quick hug and whispered, "Courage," in my ear, like we were heading into battle. In a way, we were. The first part of dinner was almost pleasant. The wine helped, a house red that tasted like it had been aged in a metal barrel but did the job. Everyone was on their best behavior, which in my family meant the insults were subtle and could be mistaken for concern if you weren't paying attention. My mother asked about my job situation 3 times in the first 20 minutes, each time phrasing it slightly differently as if I might have forgotten I was unemployed since the last time she asked. "Any interviews lined up?" she said, cutting into her chicken parmesan with the same precision she used to dissect my life choices. "A few things in the works," I replied, keeping it vague. "I had a good phone screening yesterday with a digital marketing firm downtown." "Downtown?" Brittany chimed in, wrinkling her nose. "Isn't that a terrible commute? And the parking must be astronomical." "It's actually not bad," I said. 20 minutes on a good day, and they have a parking stipend. "If you get the job," my mother added helpfully. "You know, at your age, you really can't afford to be too selective. Sometimes you just have to take what you can get and work your way up." I felt my jaw clench, but forced myself to take another sip of wine instead of responding. Emma caught my eye and made a face that almost made me laugh. Uncle Dennis decided to share his wisdom next. "You know what your problem is, Sarah?" he said, pointing his fork at me. "Your generation doesn't understand the value of hard work. When I was your age, I was working 60-hour weeks, saving every penny. I didn't worry about finding the perfect job or following my passion. I worried about paying bills and building something." "I'm not looking for the perfect job," I said quietly. "I'm looking for a job that pays a living wage and doesn't make me want to walk into traffic every morning." "So dramatic," my mother sighed. "This is what happens when you children watch too much of that self-help nonsense on the internet. Sometimes work is just work. Not everything has to be fulfilling." "But shouldn't we at least try to find something that doesn't make us miserable?" I asked, immediately regretting engaging. "Miserable?" Uncle Dennis laughed, that booming sound that made other diners turn to look. "You want to know miserable? Miserable is not having a job at all, which, if I'm not mistaken, is your current situation." The table went quiet for a moment, that particular kind of silence that happens when someone says what everyone's been thinking but was too polite to voice. I felt my face burn and focused on cutting my lasagna into smaller and smaller pieces. "I've been applying to jobs every day," I said finally. "It's not like I'm sitting around doing nothing." Of course not, honey, my mother said in that tone that meant the opposite. We just worry about you, that's all. Brittany was already married with a baby at your age. People have different paths, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Different isn't always better, Brittany added, smoothing her already perfect hair. Sometimes it's just different. Emma squeezed my knee under the table, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. I appreciated it, but it didn't make the sting any less sharp. The conversation moved on to safer topics after that, like Brittany's kids' school activities, Uncle Dennis's latest sales record, and my father's thoughts on the upcoming baseball season. I let it wash over me, contributing just enough to seem engaged, while mostly pushing food around my plate and counting down the minutes until I could leave. Then the cake came out. I heard them before I saw it. The discordant singing that happens when people who don't actually like each other that much try to perform unity. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. The waiter emerged from the kitchen carrying what looked like a standard sheet cake, white frosting with some kind of blue decoration around the edges. A single candle flickered in the center. For just a moment, I felt something warm in my chest. Maybe they did care. Maybe this was their way of trying to make things right after the awkward dinner conversation. I should have known better. I'd had 28 years of experience with my family. I should have seen it coming. But I didn't. Not until they set the cake down in front of me and I saw what was written in pink frosting across the white surface. Oops, still a disappointment. The singing stopped abruptly as I stared at the words. Someone, I think it was Brittany, started giggling. Then Uncle Dennis's booming laugh joined in, and soon most of the table was in hysterics. My mother had that tight smile on her face, the one she wore when she thought someone was being too sensitive. My father looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, as usual. It's just a joke, Sarah, Brittany managed between laughs. Don't be so sensitive. Best cake ever, Uncle Dennis declared, slapping the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. You have to admit that's funny. I stared at the cake, at those 5 words in pink frosting, and something inside me that had been bending for years finally snapped. But it didn't snap in the way they expected. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out in tears like the overly emotional disaster they'd painted me as. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the eye of a hurricane. I stood up slowly, picked up my purse, and slung it over my shoulder. Emma looked up at me, concern written across her face. Sarah, she said quietly. I'm good, I told her, and surprisingly, I meant it. Then I leaned down toward Uncle Dennis, who was still chuckling at his own perceived cleverness. I put my hand on his shoulder, gentle as could be, and whispered 5 words in his ear. Just 5 words, spoken so quietly that no one else could hear them over the restaurant noise. I know about the money. His laughter died like someone had flipped a switch. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might faint right there at the table. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. I straightened up, gave the table one last look, and walked out of Giovanni's with my head high. The parking lot was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the rain that had started again. I sat in my car for a moment, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline caught up with me. Then I turned off my phone, started the engine, and drove home. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my couch in my depressing studio apartment, and felt more at peace than I had in years. The silence lasted exactly 2 weeks. 2 blissful weeks where I ignored my turned-off phone, caught up on Netflix, applied to jobs without the constant background noise of family criticism, and started to remember who I was when I wasn't trying to live up to impossible expectations. Then, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my phone back on. The flood was immediate. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages, emails. My mother alone had called 37 times. Brittany had sent a series of increasingly frantic texts that started with, "What did you say to Uncle Dennis?" and evolved to, "You need to fix this now." Even my father had left voicemails, which was unusual enough to be concerning. But it was the message from Aunt Margaret that caught my attention. She'd sent a single text. "I heard what happened. We should talk. I'll be in town next week." You see, what they didn't know, what none of them had ever suspected, was that I knew something that could unravel their carefully constructed family narrative. And it all started 6 months before that birthday dinner on a humid Sunday in September when I'd gone to help my parents clean out their attic. My father had thrown out his back trying to move boxes by himself, and my mother had called me in a panic, not because she was worried about him, but because they'd scheduled someone to come look at installing new insulation and the attic needed to be cleared. So I'd driven out on my day off, climbed the rickety ladder to their stuffed attic, and started hauling down decades of accumulated family debris. It was like an archaeological dig through our family history. There were boxes of report cards and school photos, Christmas decorations from the 70s that probably contained enough lead to poison a small village, my father's collection of National Geographic magazines that he swore would be worth something someday, and countless other pieces of the past that no one could quite bear to throw away, but no one wanted to look at either. I was wrestling with a particularly heavy box labeled Tax Returns 1995-2000 when I knocked over an old leather suitcase that had been shoved behind it. The suitcase fell open, spilling its contents across the dusty floorboards. Most of it was what you'd expect: old clothes that smelled like mothballs, some photographs from my parents' wedding, a collection of letters tied with a ribbon that I didn't examine too closely, because there are some things you don't need to know about your parents. But there was also a manila folder, soft with age and labeled in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, Estate Planning, Final Version. My grandfather, William, had been the kind of man who commanded respect just by walking into a room. He'd built a successful construction business from nothing, raised 3 children during tough times, and had very specific ideas about right and wrong. He'd also been the only person in the family who'd ever made me feel like I was enough just as I was. When he died 5 years ago, it had hit me harder than I'd expected. I probably shouldn't have opened the folder. It wasn't my business, and I'd been raised to respect privacy. But something made me pause, sitting there in the dusty heat of the attic with sweat running down my back. Maybe it was the word final, written in his careful script. Maybe it was the way the folder had been hidden behind that suitcase like someone hadn't wanted it to be found. Or maybe I was just tired of being the good girl who followed all the rules and ended up being the family punchline anyway. Inside the folder was a copy of my grandfather's will, which I'd seen before. He'd divided his estate 3 ways between his children: my mother Linda, Uncle Dennis, and Aunt Margaret. Simple, straightforward, fair. But there were other papers in the folder, papers I definitely hadn't seen before. The first was an amendment to the will, dated a year before my grandfather's death. It was properly witnessed, notarized, and completely legal, and it changed everything. According to the amendment, Dennis was to receive nothing from the estate if he hadn't repaid a substantial loan by the time of my grandfather's death. The loan amount made me blink. $75,000, borrowed from the family business with a promise to repay within 6 months. There was a letter attached, written in my grandfather's hand. I still remember the key lines. Dennis has had more than enough time to make this right. He's used excuse after excuse, and I'm done enabling him. If he can't honor his obligations to the family business, he doesn't deserve to benefit from its success. This is not about anger, it's about accountability. But Dennis had gotten his third of the estate. I knew that for certain because he'd bought a lake house right after the will was settled, throwing a huge party to celebrate his new weekend retreat, which meant either the loan had been repaid or... I dug deeper into the folder. There were bank statements, records from the family business, and a series of increasingly frustrated letters from my grandfather to Dennis about the missing money. The last letter was dated just 2 months before my grandfather died. Dennis hadn't paid back a cent. I sat in that attic for over an hour, sweat cooling on my skin as I pieced together what must have happened. Someone had suppressed the amendment during the estate settlement. Someone with access to the documents and the ability to influence the process. The will had been handled by my mother as the oldest child, and the one who lived closest to my grandfather. She'd been the one to go through his papers, work with the lawyer, and distribute the inheritance. My mother had known about the amendment, and she'd buried it. I took pictures. I just threw it. It was about tired. The first, Sarah, Patricia, finally, he was always harder on him than the girls. It wasn't fair. So you made it fair by ignoring his legal wishes? I did what I thought was best for the family, she snapped, and there it was, the self-righteousness that had justified 1,000 small cruelties over the years. You committed fraud. I said quietly. You and Dennis. You stole from Grandpa's estate and from Aunt Margaret. Don't be dramatic. Margaret got her share. She got a third when she should have gotten half. That's a significant amount of money, Mom. Money that could have made a real difference in her life. Margaret is doing fine, my mother said dismissively. She doesn't need it like Dennis did. That wasn't your decision to make. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by my own daughter about decisions made years ago, especially not by someone who can't even hold down a job. And there it was. Even cornered, even caught in a massive lie, she couldn't resist taking a shot. Some things never change. You're right, I said calmly. You don't have to sit there and be lectured by me. You can sit there and be questioned by Aunt Margaret's lawyer instead. I hung up before she could respond. The next few days were a whirlwind of family drama. My phone rang constantly. Brittany left increasingly hysterical voicemails about how I was tearing the family apart and being selfish as usual. Various cousins reached out, having heard bits and pieces of the story and wanting to know what was really going on. Emma was my lifeline through it all, meeting me for coffee and letting me vent about each new development. I can't believe they hid this for 5 years, she said during one of our sessions at a local cafe. Actually, scratch that. I can totally believe it. Your mom and Dennis have always thought the rules didn't apply to them. The thing is, I said, stirring my latte absently, I wasn't even planning to do anything with the information. I just wanted Dennis to sweat a little, to feel uncomfortable for once. But now they're panicking and making it worse, Emma finished. Classic Linda and Dennis. They can't just let something be. They have to control the narrative. She was right. The more they pushed, the more I thought about what Aunt Margaret had missed out on. Not just the money, though that was significant, but the betrayal of it. Her own siblings had conspired against her, stolen from her, and then sat across from her at family dinners for 5 years like nothing had happened. That's when I decided to call Aunt Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm despite the circumstances. Sarah, I've been hoping you'd call. Emma filled me in on some of what happened, but I'd like to hear it from you. So I told her everything. Finding the documents, sitting on the secret for 6 months, the birthday dinner disaster, and my impulsive whisper to Dennis. I even sent her the photos I'd taken of all the documents while we were on the phone. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, I knew something wasn't right when Dad died. The estate settled too quickly, too smoothly. Dennis suddenly had all this money for the lake house, but he'd been complaining about business troubles for months before. But Linda handled everything, and I trusted her. She was my sister. The pain in her voice on that last word made my chest tight. I'm sorry, I said. I should have told you sooner. No, she said firmly. You told me when you were ready. That's all anyone can ask. The question now is what to do about it. What do you want to do? I'm going to call a lawyer, she said. And there was steel in her voice now. Not because I need the money, though I won't lie and say it wouldn't help, but because Dad's wishes should have been honored. He was very specific about what he wanted, and they ignored it for their own gain. That's not right. They'll fight it, I warned, and it'll get ugly. Oh, honey, she laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It's already ugly. They made it ugly 5 years ago when they decided Dennis's wants were more important than Dad's wishes or my rights. I'm just shining a light on it. She was right, of course. The ugliness had always been there, hidden under family dinners and holiday cards and the fiction that we were close. All I'd done was refuse to play along anymore. That's when things really escalated. Dennis, in a panic, decided the best defense was a good offense. He took to Facebook with a long, rambling post about how certain family members were trying to destroy his reputation out of jealousy and spite. He painted himself as a successful businessman under attack by relatives who couldn't stand to see him thrive. The post backfired spectacularly. For one thing, Dennis had clearly written it after several drinks, and it showed. The spelling errors alone were entertaining, but the real issue was that he'd accidentally included details that made people ask questions. Why was he talking about inheritance disputes from 5 years ago? What documents was he referring to? Why was he so defensive if he hadn't done anything wrong? The comments section became a battlefield. Some distant relatives rallied to his defense, mainly the ones who didn't know the full story. But others, particularly those who'd known my grandfather well, started asking pointed questions. My cousin Lisa, Aunt Margaret's daughter, posted screenshots of the amendment I'd shared with her mother, along with a simple comment. "This is fraud. If you're more upset about it being exposed than it happening, you're part of the problem." Emma jumped in to support her, and soon the family Facebook page was split into camps. It was messier than I'd ever intended, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty. They'd had 5 years to come clean, 5 years to make it right. They'd chosen comfortable lies instead. Meanwhile, Aunt Margaret had found a lawyer, a sharp woman named Diane Chen who specialized in estate fraud. After reviewing the documents, Diane's assessment was blunt. This was textbook fraud, and the evidence was overwhelming. The amendment was properly executed, she explained during a conference call with me and Margaret. It was notarized, witnessed, and delivered to the estate attorney before your grandfather's death. The fact that it wasn't included in the probate process, combined with the evidence that both Linda and Dennis knew about it, constitutes deliberate suppression of material documents. That's fraud. "What about the statute of limitations?" I asked, remembering enough from my business law classes to know that might be an issue. "In Ohio, the discovery rule applies," Diane said. "The clock starts when the fraud is discovered, not when it occurred. Since you just found these documents and informed the affected party, we're well within the time frame to take action." The legal wheels started turning. Diane filed a petition with the probate court to reopen the estate based on newly discovered evidence of fraud. She subpoenaed bank records, emails, and any correspondence related to the estate settlement. The court took it seriously, especially when they saw the notarized amendment that had somehow vanished during the original probate process. Dennis hired his own lawyer, of course, some golf buddy who'd handled his business contracts but was clearly out of his depth with estate fraud. They tried to argue that the amendment wasn't valid, that my grandfather had been coerced or wasn't of sound mind when he'd signed it. But the evidence said otherwise. The witnesses to the amendment testified that my grandfather had been sharp, clear, and very specific about his intentions. The email trail was particularly damaging. Diane's team found correspondence between Dennis and my mother from right after my grandfather's death, where they discussed the estate. In one email, Dennis actually wrote, "Thanks for handling that complication. Had never did understand how business works." My mother's reply was equally incriminating. "Family comes first. Dad would understand eventually." They'd put their fraud in writing. Amateur hour. The depositions were brutal. I had to testify about finding the documents, which meant sitting in a conference room with my mother and Dennis glaring at me like I'd personally betrayed them. My mother tried to catch my eye several times, doing that thing where she'd mouth please when she thought the lawyers weren't looking. Dennis just looked angry, his face red and blotchy like he'd been drinking too much, which he probably had. When it was my mother's turn to be deposed, she tried to play the caring matriarch card. She'd only been trying to keep the family together. She'd thought her father's decision was rash, made in anger. She'd planned to tell Margaret eventually, but the timing had never been right. The lawyer dismantled each excuse with surgical precision. "Mrs. Anderson, you were aware of the amendment to your father's will?" "I had seen a draft, yes, but this notarized document isn't a draft." "You knew about this final version?" "I may have seen it." "And you chose not to include it in the probate filing?" "I thought there might be issues with its validity." "Did you consult with an attorney about these validity issues?" "Not specifically, no." "So you made a unilateral decision to suppress a legal document that would have significantly impacted the distribution of your father's estate?" "I wouldn't say suppress. What would you call it when you deliberately exclude a document from probate proceedings?" It went on like that for hours. By the end, my mother looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, her perfect facade cracked beyond repair. Dennis's deposition was even worse. He contradicted himself multiple times, claimed he couldn't remember key details, and at one point actually said he'd considered the money from my grandfather a gift rather than a loan, despite having signed documents saying otherwise. The court case took 8 months from start to finish. 8 months of depositions, document reviews, and family warfare. My phone became a battlefield of texts and calls. Some relatives supported me and Margaret, saying it was about time someone stood up to Dennis and Linda. Others accused us of being greedy, of dishonoring my grandfather's memory, of destroying the family over money. "It's not about money," I told one particularly nasty cousin who called to berate me. "It's about truth. It's about respecting Grandpa's wishes. It's about accountability." "Easy for you to say," she snapped. "You don't have kids to put through college like Dennis does." "Maybe he should have thought about that before stealing from the family business and then the estate," I replied, then hung up. I was getting better at not engaging with the flying monkeys. Through it all, my relationship with Emma and Aunt Margaret grew stronger. Margaret flew in from Seattle several times for court proceedings, and we'd have dinner together, sometimes with Emma and Lisa. Those dinners were everything family gatherings should be: supportive, honest, full of genuine laughter instead of cutting remarks disguised as jokes. "I'm proud of you," Margaret told me one evening over Vietnamese food. "What you did took courage. Most people would have kept quiet to avoid the confrontation." "I almost did," I admitted. "I sat on it for 6 months, remember? If they hadn't given me that cake, if they'd just been decent for once, I probably would have taken it to my grave." "But they couldn't be decent," Emma pointed out. "Because this is who they are. The cake was just the latest example of their need to keep you in your place. They need a scapegoat to feel better about themselves." She was right, and it was liberating to finally see it clearly. I'd spent years internalizing their criticism, believing there must be something wrong with me to inspire such consistent disdain. But it was never about me. It was about them and their need to maintain a hierarchy where someone had to be at the bottom. The judge's ruling came down on a Thursday afternoon in November. I was at home, having just gotten back from my new job, when Diane called with the news. The court had found in Aunt Margaret's favor on all counts. Dennis was ordered to repay his entire inheritance plus interest, bringing the total to nearly $300,000. My mother was fined $25,000 for her role in the fraud and was required to issue a formal acknowledgement of her actions. The judge's written opinion was scathing. He called their actions a deliberate and calculated breach of fiduciary duty and noted that their attempts to justify the fraud during trial showed a stunning lack of remorse or accountability. He ordered that the money be paid within 90 days, or liens would be placed on their assets. Dennis had to sell the lake house. It went on the market within 2 weeks, priced to sell quickly. The "for sale" sign in front of his weekend retreat became a monument to consequences finally catching up. He also had to liquidate some of his business assets and take out loans to cover the rest. The man who'd spent years bragging about his business acumen was suddenly scrambling to avoid bankruptcy. My mother's situation was less dire financially, but perhaps worse socially. The formal acknowledgement required by the court had to be published in the local paper's legal notices. Everyone in their social circle saw it. Her book club, her church group, the country club where she'd lunched for decades. They all knew Linda Anderson had committed fraud against her own father's estate and her own sister. The fallout in the family was immediate and brutal. The family Facebook page exploded with reactions to the ruling. Some relatives who'd stayed neutral during the fight suddenly had strong opinions. My grandfather's brother, Uncle Carl, wrote a long post about how William would be spinning in his grave over his children's behavior. "He was a man of his word," Carl wrote, "and he raised you better than this." Dennis tried damage control, posting about how he was the victim of a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But when people pointed out that a judge had reviewed all the evidence and called it fraud, he deleted his post and went radio silent. His wife, Patricia, changed all her social media to private and stopped coming to family events. Brittany, predictably, remained loyal to our mother. She called me crying one night, alternating between begging me to make this go away and screaming that I'd ruined everything. When I calmly explained that all I'd done was expose the truth, she hung up on me. We haven't spoken since. My father was perhaps the most surprising. He called me a week after the ruling, his voice quiet and tired. "I need you to know I didn't know," he said, "about the amendment, about any of it. Your mother told me the estate was divided evenly, and I believed her. I should have asked more questions." "Why didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious. He was silent for a long moment. Because it was easier not to. Because I've spent 30 years taking the path of least resistance with your mother. Because I convinced myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. I was wrong. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. He told me he'd moved into a hotel, that he was meeting with a divorce attorney. The fraud, the stress, the fact that the cracks had always been there. I'd just stopped spackling over them with silence and compliance. As the dust settled, new relationships emerged from the rubble. Cousins I'd barely talked to reached out, sharing their own stories of feeling marginalized by the family power structure. Aunt Margaret and I became genuinely close, talking weekly and planning visits. She used part of the recovered money to start a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name for first-generation college students in construction management, which would have made him proud. He would have been devastated by what Linda and Dennis did, she told me during one of our calls. But he would have been proud of you for standing up to them. He always said you had backbone. You just needed to find it. Emma remained my rock through everything. She was there for the late-night panic attacks when I wondered if I'd done the right thing, the small celebrations when the legal wins came through, and the quiet moments when I grieved the family I'd thought I had. "You know what the best part is?" she said one evening over wine. "You're free now, really free. You never have to sit through another dinner where they make you feel small. You never have to pretend their cruelty is love. You can choose your own family now." She was right. I'd spent so long trying to earn a place at a table where I was only welcome as the butt of the joke. Now I was building my own table, surrounded by people who actually liked me, who celebrated my successes instead of diminishing them, who could tease without drawing blood. The 1-year anniversary of the birthday cake incident found me in a very different place. I was thriving in my new job, had moved to a bigger apartment with actual sunlight, and had built a support system of chosen family. Emma suggested we mark the occasion somehow, and I knew exactly what to do. I ordered a cake from my favorite bakery, white frosting with pink lettering, just like the one from that night. But this one said something different. "Surprise! I'm actually doing great." We ate it at my apartment, Emma, Aunt Margaret, Lisa, and a few other cousins who'd emerged as allies. We laughed about the absurdity of it all, how a cake meant to humiliate me had instead freed me from years of dysfunction. Margaret raised a toast to Sarah, who reminded us all that the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient. Looking back now, 4 years later, I can see that night at Giovanni's as the pivot point it was. In trying to put me in my place one more time, my family had handed me the key to my own liberation. They'd pushed too hard, assumed I'd always be the quiet one who took it, and learned that even the family scapegoat has limits. Dennis never recovered financially or socially. His business struggled without the cushion of stolen money, and his reputation in the community was permanently damaged. He moved to Florida eventually, starting over where nobody knew about the fraud. My mother adapted as she always did, crafting a new narrative where she was the victim of a misunderstanding. She found new social circles who didn't know the full story, though the whispers followed her everywhere. "We haven't spoken in 3 years, and I'm okay with that." Brittany still sends Christmas cards with photos of her children and passive-aggressive notes about how families should forgive each other. I don't respond. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding, especially when the person on the other side is still holding matches. My father and I have built something new, tentative, but real. We have lunch once a month, talk about baseball and books, and carefully avoid the minefield of the past. He's in therapy too, working through his own realizations about the life he'd accepted. "I should have protected you," he said once. "That was my job, and I failed." I told him I didn't need apologies, just presence, and he's been good about showing up. The family reunions don't happen anymore. Too much bad blood, too many sides chosen. But the people who matter find ways to connect. Margaret hosts Thanksgiving now, and it's everything the old gatherings weren't: warm, genuine, free of underlying tension. We can actually relax, be ourselves, enjoy each other's company without waiting for the next veiled insult. Sometimes I think about that night at Giovanni's, about the moment I saw those words on the cake and felt something fundamental shift inside me. They'd meant to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy, to keep me small and ashamed. Instead, they'd freed me from the exhausting performance of pretending their dysfunction was normal, their cruelty was care. Would I do it again? Absolutely. Not because I wanted to hurt them, though I won't pretend their pain didn't feel like justice, but because living in truth, even messy and painful truth, is better than living in comfortable lies. Because my grandfather deserved to have his wishes honored. Because Aunt Margaret deserved what was rightfully hers. And because I deserved to stop being the family's designated disappointment. The birthday cake they gave me was meant to be a joke, another reminder that I'd never quite measure up to their standards. But here's the thing about standards. They only matter if you respect the people setting them. And I'd finally realized that the opinion of people who would serve cruelty for dessert wasn't worth the frosting it was written in. These days, when people ask about my family, I tell them the truth. I have a small but mighty chosen family who shows up for me without judgment, celebrates my wins without jealousy, and can joke without drawing blood. I have an aunt who became the mother figure I needed, cousins who became true friends, and a father who's learning how to be present. And I have myself, no longer the family disappointment, but my own success story. The money from Grandpa's estate? Aunt Margaret tried to give me a portion of it, saying I deserved it for exposing the truth. I turned it down. I didn't need their money. I'd already gotten something far more valuable, my freedom, my voice, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't planned or plotted. Sometimes it's just refusing to be silent when they expect you to be, refusing to play your assigned role in their dysfunction. Every year on my birthday now, Emma insists on getting me a cake. They're always beautiful, always have kind or funny messages, and never, ever include the word disappointment. It's a small thing, but it matters. Because birthdays should be about celebration, not humiliation. Families should be about support, not hierarchy. And love, real love, doesn't require you to be the butt of the joke to earn your seat at the table. I learned all of that the hard way, through lawyers and court dates and family explosions. But I learned it. And that birthday, the one where they tried to break me with frosting and spite, that was the birthday I finally grew into myself, not despite their cruelty, but because of it. They pushed, and for the first time in my life, I pushed back. And it turns out, when you stop accepting the role they've assigned you, when you refuse to be their disappointment, you might just discover you were never a disappointment at all. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to be one. So thank you, family, for that cake. It wasn't the gift you intended, but it was exactly what I needed. A reminder that sometimes the best thing you can do is refuse to eat what they're serving and go find your own feast elsewhere. And let me tell you, life tastes so much sweeter when it's not seasoned with casual cruelty and served with a side of humiliation. That's my story. The story of how 5 words in pink frosting changed everything, how family secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, and how sometimes the person everyone dismisses as the family disappointment is the only one with enough courage to tell the truth. It wasn't the birthday party anyone planned, but it was the one that needed to happen. And in the end, that cake they meant to hurt me with became my liberation. But there's more to this story, parts I haven't shared yet. Moments that still take my breath away when I remember them. Like the morning 3 months after the court ruling when I ran into Patricia, Dennis's wife, at the grocery store. I was reaching for avocados when I heard her voice behind me, soft and uncertain. "Sarah?" I turned around slowly, bracing myself for confrontation. But Patricia looked different than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the country club polish, the perfect makeup, the careful smile. She looked tired, real in a way she'd never allowed herself to be at family gatherings. "I won't keep you," she said quickly, clutching her purse like a shield. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For all of it. For the cake. For the years of everything. I stood there holding an avocado, completely unprepared for an apology I'd never expected to receive. "Patricia, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. "I knew what they were doing to you was wrong. Every dinner, every gathering, every little dig. I saw it, and I said nothing because I was grateful it wasn't directed at me." Her honesty was devastating in its simplicity. She'd been another woman trying to survive in a family that consumed its own, and she'd done it by staying quiet, by being complicit. I understood that survival instinct better than she knew. "I'm leaving him," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for years. The money, the fraud, it was just the final straw. But really, I'm leaving because I don't want to be the kind of person who stands by while people are cruel anymore. I don't want my daughters to grow up thinking that's what love looks like. We stood there in the produce section, two women who'd been shaped by the same toxic family dynamic in different ways, finding an unexpected moment of connection. I reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Good for you," I said, and meant it. "Your daughters are lucky to have a mom who's willing to change course." She smiled through her tears, a real smile this time, and walked away. I later heard she'd moved back to her hometown in Indiana, started over with her girls in a little house near her parents. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you've been on the wrong side and choose differently. Then there was the letter that arrived 6 months after that grocery store encounter. I almost didn't open it when I saw the return address, my childhood home, my mother's handwriting. But curiosity won, as it always does with me. Inside was a single sheet of her monogrammed stationery and a check for $5,000. "Sarah," the letter began, "I know you don't want to hear from me. I understand that. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to explain myself again. I'm writing because I've been seeing a therapist trying to understand how I became someone who could do what I did." She asked me to think about moments when I chose being right over being kind, when I chose control over connection. The list was longer than I want to admit. The money is from the sale of some jewelry my mother left me. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to have something from our family that wasn't tainted by conditions or criticism. You were right about the cake. You were right about all of it. I'm sorry I couldn't see you for who you really are instead of who I thought you should be. I don't expect a response. I just needed you to know that I finally understand why you walked away, and why you were right to do so. I sat with that letter for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to reconcile the woman who wrote it with the mother who'd served cruelty for dessert. In the end, I cashed the check and donated it to the scholarship fund Aunt Margaret had set up in Grandpa's name. It felt like the right way to transform something painful into something useful. The therapy journey she mentioned resonated with me because my own healing hadn't been linear or simple. There were days when I woke up feeling like that 28-year-old at Giovanni's again, small and worthless despite all evidence to the contrary. Dr. Williams called these emotional flashbacks, moments when your body remembers trauma even when your mind knows you're safe. "Healing isn't about forgetting," she told me during one particularly difficult session. "It's about integrating the experience in a way that doesn't control you anymore. You get to decide what role this plays in your story." One of the hardest parts was grieving the family I'd never actually had. I'd spent so many years hoping things would change that one day they'd see me and value me for who I was. Letting go of that hope felt like a death, and in many ways, it was. I had to mourn the parents who couldn't love me unconditionally, the sister who saw me as competition rather than companion, the extended family who needed a scapegoat more than they needed connection. But with that grief came freedom. I started making choices based on what I actually wanted, rather than what might finally earn their approval. I took a solo trip to Italy, something my mother would have called unnecessarily indulgent. I adopted a rescue dog, a pit bull mix named Rosie, who'd been overlooked at the shelter just like I'd been overlooked at family dinners. I started painting again, something I'd loved as a child but had abandoned when Brittany's artistic talents had been deemed superior. The painting led to an unexpected development. I'd been sharing my work on Instagram, mostly for my own enjoyment, when a local gallery owner reached out. She'd seen my series on family dynamics, abstract pieces that captured the feeling of being unseen in a crowd, and wanted to feature them in a group show about resilience. Opening night of that show was surreal. There I was, surrounded by people who saw value in my perspective, who understood the emotion I'd poured into each canvas. Emma was there, of course, and Aunt Margaret had flown in specially for it. Even my father came, standing quietly in front of a piece I'd titled The Weight of Silence, with tears in his eyes. "This is how it felt, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "All those dinners, all those gatherings where they—" He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. He got it. The paintings sold well, but more importantly, they connected with people. I received messages from others who'd been their family's designated disappointment, who'd been served cruelty disguised as care, who'd finally found the courage to walk away. We formed an informal support group, meeting monthly to share stories and strategies for healing. One woman, Teresa, had been disinherited for marrying outside her family's religion. Another, Marcus, had been the scapegoat for his brother's addiction issues. There was Chen, whose immigrant parents couldn't accept his career in social work instead of medicine, and Diana, whose family had frozen her out for refusing to cover up her uncle's abuse. Each story was different, but the patterns were the same. Families who needed someone to blame, someone to be less than, so they could feel like more. "The thing that gets me," Teresa said during one meeting, "is how they make you feel crazy for wanting basic respect, like you're asking for too much by expecting to be treated with dignity." "Or how they rewrite history," Marcus added. "Suddenly, you're the one who destroyed the family by speaking up, not them for creating a situation that needed speaking up about." These conversations were healing in ways therapy alone couldn't touch. There's something powerful about being understood by people who've walked similar paths, who know the particular grief of being rejected by the people who are supposed to love you most. Through all of this growth and healing, I watched from a distance as my original family continued to fracture. Dennis's business eventually folded completely. Without the stolen money to prop it up and with his reputation in tatters, he couldn't maintain the facade of success he'd built. The last I heard, he was working as a middle manager at someone else's dealership, a far cry from the empire he'd bragged about at all those family dinners. My mother tried to maintain her social standing, but whispers follow you in a small community. She left the country club after someone made a pointed comment about family values during a charity auction. Her book club politely suggested she might be more comfortable in a different group. She adapted, as she always did, but the careful social structure she'd spent decades building had crumbled. Brittany had perhaps the most interesting journey. Initially, she'd been firmly in our mother's camp, furious at me for destroying everything. But as time passed and the dust settled, cracks appeared in her own perfect facade. Her husband, Marcus, reached out to me privately about a year after the court case. "She's struggling," he told me over coffee. "Seeing your parents' marriage fall apart, watching the family dynamics get exposed, it's making her question everything. She's starting to realize that maybe the way she was treated wasn't normal either." "She was the golden child," I said, not unkindly. "That comes with its own pressures." "She's in therapy now," he said. "Working through a lot. I think she might reach out to you eventually, when she's ready." That day came 2 years later. I was at my apartment working on a new painting when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer anyway. "Sarah? It's Brittany." I set down my brush, my hand suddenly shaking. "Hi." "I know I have no right to call you," she said quickly, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything I said, everything I did. But I wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not that surface-level stuff Mom taught us." We talked for 2 hours that day. She told me about her own therapy journey, about recognizing how she'd been pitted against me from childhood, how our mother had used comparison and competition to control us both. She'd been the winner in that sick game, but winning had come with its own costs. The pressure to be perfect, the fear of falling from grace, the inability to be vulnerable or authentic. "I was so angry at you for ruining everything," she admitted. "But you didn't ruin it. You revealed that it was already broken. And honestly, I'm grateful. I was drowning in that perfection. And I didn't even know it." We're not close now, not like sisters in movies who overcome everything to become best friends. The wounds went too deep for that kind of fairy tale ending. But we have something real, tentative but honest. We text occasionally, sharing small victories and struggles. She sends me pictures of her kids, who I'm slowly getting to know as their aunt. It's not what we might have had in a healthier family, but it's what we can build from the rubble. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other family secrets began surfacing once the seal of silence had been broken. It turned out Dennis's fraud wasn't the only skeleton in the family closet. An cousin came forward about inappropriate behavior from a family friend that had been brushed under the rug years ago. Another relative admitted to struggling with addiction, something the family had pretended not to notice. The perfect family facade had been hiding so much pain, so much dysfunction, all of it festering in the dark. Some people say I destroyed my family, and maybe they're right. But sometimes destruction is necessary. Sometimes you have to tear down a rotten structure before you can build something healthy. The family I destroyed was one built on lies, manipulation, and the need for someone to always be beneath someone else. If telling the truth could destroy it, then it needed to be destroyed. Now, 5 years after that birthday dinner, I can see the whole journey with clearer eyes. The cake with its cruel message was meant to keep me in my place, to remind me that I was less than, disappointing, not quite enough. Instead, it's the skull aunt. There's new friend. As for my mother, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if they'd just given me a normal birthday cake. If they'd chosen kindness over cruelty, just that once. Would I have ever found the courage to speak up? Would the truth about Dennis and the will have stayed buried forever? Would I still be sitting at their table, swallowing insults with my dinner, believing that was what love looked like? I'll never know, and I'm grateful for that. Because the life I have now, messy and complicated but authentically mine, is worth more than a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. The birthday cake they gave me, with its cruel message in pink frosting, turned out to be the best gift they ever gave me. Not because of what it said, but because of what it sparked. The courage to finally say, enough. So thank you, family, for showing me so clearly what I didn't want my life to be. Thank you for the cruelty that became my catalyst. Thank you for the rejection that led me to acceptance, just not from you. And thank you for that cake, that beautiful, terrible cake that changed everything. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know then. Disappointment is often just a matter of perspective. They were disappointed in me because I wouldn't play my assigned role in their dysfunction. But from where I'm standing now, surrounded by genuine love and authentic connections, building a life based on truth rather than pretense, I can see clearly who the real disappointment was. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't me. That's the gift hidden in the cruelest rejection, the blessing wrapped in the ugliest pain. When the people who are supposed to love you show you clearly that they don't. At least not in any way that nourishes your soul, you're free to go find the people who do. And those people, the ones who see your worth without needing to diminish it, who celebrate your victories without keeping score, who can tease without drawing blood, those people are out there waiting to become your real family. I found mine, and it all started with a birthday cake that told the truth about how they saw me, which finally gave me permission to see the truth about them. 5 words in pink frosting. Oops. Still a disappointment. 5 words that set me free.